Hello, my dear brothers and sisters. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We are on part 39 today. We're going to do the last of these sessions on the topic of a shifting landscape. And the topic for this one today is Eastern Christianity. And so we begin this discussion today by looking at Byzantine Christianity. The support that Christianity had traditionally received from the Byzantine Empire was a mixed blessing. If you'll remember, we talked quite a bit in season 1 about the differences between the West Church and the East Church after their schism and what brought about that breakup and how they developed. We really kind of took the road with the Western Church from that point on. Now we're going to kind of look back and see what happened to the Eastern Church a little bit more. While its relation to the empire gave the Greek Church great prestige, it also suffered greatly limited freedom. While in the West, popes were often more powerful than kings or even emperors, in the East, emperors ruled the church, and patriarchs who did not do their bidding were easily deposed and replaced. And this was the biggest thing, and again, this was brought up in season 1. This was the biggest difference between the way the church in the East developed and the way the church in the West developed, was the political circumstances. So in the West, the church exerted much more influence on the state. In fact, for much of the history of the development of Western civilization, the church had quite a lot of say in who rulers were. Often emperors or rulers were appointed or at least had the blessing of the Pope. And so the Western church saw a lot of power, whereas the Eastern church was completely under the authority of the state. So two very different things. It's the separation of church and state didn't happen in either one, but much more often in the West, it was the church that influenced the things of the state, whereas much more often in the East, it was the state that dictated what happened in the church. So those two differences are going to have a lot to say about how the church in the East is going to develop. When the emperor decided that reunion with Rome was necessary in order to save his empire, that reunion was achieved despite the wishes of the vast majority of the Byzantine church. Again, I'll point you back to season 1. There was a time when it looked like the schism was going to be repaired, and the church did reunite briefly. And it was a political reason for it. The Roman church was willing to accept the Eastern church on their own terms. Obviously, the Eastern church didn't like that. It has some very particular feelings about the Western church, and most of those were that the Western church was heretical. And so they didn't want to be reunited with them, but it didn't matter because in the East, it was what the politicians wanted that mattered. It was what the emperor wanted. And so that was what took place. And again, the vast majority of the Byzantine church was actively against that happening. A year later, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Turks. Many Byzantine Christians interpreted that event as an act of liberation from a tyrannical emperor who had forced them to unite with heretical Rome. Now, again, remember back, the reason that this political decision was made was because the emperor in Constantinople knew that they were about to be taken over by the Turks, and he needed the help of the West. But what happened, it didn't work. The West wasn't willing to really do what it would take to help the East, and so the East was overtaken anyway. The Hail Mary didn't get caught. And so the people looking at this, not wanting it to happen, said, well, hey, there you go. You got what you had coming to you. Look at how God did. He didn't want you to do this. You tried to unite us with a Western church that we feel like is heretical, and so you got just what you had coming to you. Again, that's from their perspective. Not necessarily everybody would agree with that. Obviously, the Pope wouldn't agree with that, and the rulers don't agree with it, but many of the people thought that they kind of got what they had coming to them. At first, the Ottoman regime granted a measure of freedom to the church. Muhammad II invited the bishops to elect a new patriarch to whom he granted both civil and ecclesiastical authority over Christians in his territories. So for a little while, it didn't seem like this was so bad. In 1516, the Ottomans conquered Syria and Palestine. Christians there were also placed under the government of the Patriarch of Constantinople. So now these churches that had been somewhat independent are going to be placed under the one Orthodox Church in Constantinople. So that's going to be a little bit of different thing than what they had had. In 1517, when Egypt fell to the Turks, the Patriarch of Alexandria was given special powers over Christians in Egypt. Though this policy made patriarchs rulers of a Christian state within the much larger Turkish state, it also meant that a patriarch who did not implement the Sultan's policies was soon deposed. So they kind of granted a little bit of a special case for Egypt. And the Patriarch of Alexandria, remember, we don't really know this today because it's not the case, but early in Christianity, Alexandria was a huge center of the Christian world. And the Patriarch of Alexandria was in a pretty prime position. So even the Turks knew that, and they weren't willing to just come in and say, okay, you have to be under the Constantinople too, and gave him what he didn't give to the churches in Syria and Palestine. And so you have kind of two groups ruling a state within a state in the Turkish Empire. And you probably already are aware from what I've said and what we studied about last season, but there's going to be a lot of conflict with the West, and it's not going to just be in the past, it's going to be ongoing. For several centuries, theological activity in the Greek-speaking church revolved around Western influences and reactions against it. So there weren't a lot of theological ground being plowed. There wasn't a lot of call for reform of the church or theology in the East. All of that primarily happened in the West, but they weren't living in a world where they didn't know about it. And so there were definitely people in the East that maybe it wasn't happening directly to them or within their church, but they knew what was happening in the Western church. And they were obviously going to be influenced by that. And so they're going to have reactions. For the most part, it's going to be in a negative way. It's going to be against things that are happening in the West. But as we'll see, it won't 100% be that. The issues debated in the West during the Protestant Reformation were also discussed in the Greek-speaking church. So those same issues brought up by Martin Luther and the other leaders of the Reformation are going to filter their way over to the East, and they're definitely going to be a point of discussion for the East. In 1629, Cyril Lucaris, Patriarch of Constantinople, published a confession of faith that was Protestant in many ways. Lucaris was eventually deposed and murdered, but his memory was venerated by many, and some claimed his confession of faith was spurious. So this guy is going to he's going to basically go along with Protestantism in many, many key ways. And that was a huge deal because there's no way the Eastern Orthodox Church is going to say that this Western philosophy, even though it was a reaction against Catholicism, which they weren't crazy about, they were not going to say that was the right way to go. And so when you've got a guy who's the Patriarch of Constantinople, that puts him in the position that would be like the Pope, although he didn't have the same power the Pope did, but still very, very high, very influential. He's all of a sudden he's basically almost full-blown Protestant. And that couldn't be. So he got deposed and murdered, but people remembered what he stood for, and it's going to continue to be remembered. Eventually, in 1672, a synod condemned him as being a Calvinist heretic. So he was definitely on the Reformed end, and they made a big stand against him. But again, it's not going to just mean that those ideas are going to go away. By the next century, the issue was no longer Protestantism. Instead, it was Western philosophy and science and the impact they ought to have on Orthodox theology. So again, what's going on in the West is going to filter over to the East, and the church is going to have to deal with that whether they like it or not. In the 19th century, when Greece became independent of Turkey, this issue took on political overtones. So Greece is going to develop in a certain particular way that's going to be very much along the lines of what's happening in the West. And that's going to filter into politics and nationalism and also into the church. In general, Greek nationalism sided with those who advocated the introduction of Western methods of research and scholarship, and who also argued that the Greek church should be independent from the Patriarch of Constantinople. So the Greek nationalists are going to say, hey, we need to, what the West has got going on with the ideas about science and scholarship and research, we need to incorporate that. That's the right way to go. And also, by the way, we need to split away from Constantinople. We want to be identified more with the West and less with the East. So that's going to certainly be a big issue. The conservatives, on the other hand, held that commonly received tradition should guide scholarship, and that part of that tradition was subjection to the Patriarch of Constantinople, even though he was subject to the Turkish Sultan. So they even said that being independent was not correct, that they because of tradition, they needed to stay with the Patriarch of Constantinople, even though that patriarch was doing what the sultan, the Turkish sultan, who was not obviously not a Christian, he was a Muslim, what he was telling him to do. They preferred that because of the force of tradition over being independent and actually being under what, at least what they would perceive God's telling them to do. So that's very interesting, but it was, it's kind of the way of conservatism, is to stick with the way things have always been and be a little bit reluctant to change. And they certainly were in this case, as they are in a lot of cases through history. So now we'll look at the Russian church, and we'll spend a good amount of time on this. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Ottoman Empire broke down and national Orthodox churches were formed in Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania. In each of these states, the tension between nationalist sentiments and the transnational nature of Orthodoxy was a dominant issue. So basically, it's kind of the same thing that happened in the West as well. As nationalism's coming in, as you're identifying more with your own people in your own country, the borders of your nation, trying to establish those, trying to establish an identity, you are going to have an issue with a universal church, or at least a universal church in your area that goes outside of those borders. You're going to want it to identify more with your own people rather than with somebody else that is in another nation calling the shots. And so that's going to become a point of contention for a while now. In the period between the two world wars, the autonomy of the various Orthodox churches in the former Turkish territories in the Balkans, as well as Estonia, Latvia, and Czechoslovakia, was recognized. So this autonomy that they wanted was going to be eventually going to come about, and they would be able to identify with their own country rather than just with the Patriarch of Constantinople or wherever. Since most of these territories fell under Russian authority after World War II, Soviet religious policies applied to them. What would that be? In spite of the difficulties they suffered, the various Orthodox churches that found themselves under Soviet rule did show signs of vitality. So they're gonna have to deal with some things. It's not going to be great. For a time, it was feared that the loss of church schools and the pressure of government propaganda would keep newer generations away from the church. And certainly the government is not going to full-blown throw the church out or ban it, but is definitely going to restrict it highly and make it to where it's not a big advantage. In fact, it's going to be a detriment for your career to even be involved in the church at all. So there are going to be some trying times ahead for the Russian church. Although the civil disabilities under which Christians were placed in several of these states at various times resulted in a decline in active church participation on the part of those involved in the job market, vast numbers returned to the church after retirement. So basically, while you were in the working world, it was better not to be involved with the church, or at least not to let it be known that you were. But after you retired, you could, because you weren't dependent on having a job anymore. You weren't dependent on what could happen to you if it was known that you were going to be involved in the church, or that you were involved in the church, or at least suspected that you were. So, but it didn't mean their faith went away. It just meant that, well, I've got to survive, and the way I have to survive is I've got to distance myself from the church, not reject it, not to even leave it completely, but at least to create enough distance and that it's not suspected that I'm heavily involved in it. But then after retirement, I can come back. Now, you can think what you want to about that. I know it's easy for us to sit here and say, well, wait a minute, that's not the right way to do it. And I wouldn't disagree with that. But on the other hand, until you've walked in the shoes of somebody that has to deal with this kind of stuff, it's easy for us to say. We can look back on a long legacy of people who gave up everything to follow Christ. And we know that's what we're called to do. Don't get me wrong. But it's an easy thing for us to say. Those of us who have lived in the Western world and have never had any persecution, and none of us have. If you're a Christian in the United States of America and that's the only place you've ever lived, you have not been persecuted. Persecution, if you go back and look historically, persecution is not just somebody laughing at you. It's not just somebody making fun of you. It's not somebody even giving you a hard time at school or at work or whatever. That's not persecution. Persecution was when people had to give up their livelihoods, their families, every dime they had, their lives. I mean, to be beaten, to be always, never know from one day to the next what was going to happen, whether you be alive or dead. That's persecution. We don't understand what that's like. We don't understand what it's like to live under that weight. And yes, it's a high calling. And, who's to say that one day we won't have to face that too? I don't know. But I'm reluctant to get down on anybody that maybe didn't pass the test so much, because I haven't even actually ever had to take the test. So while I know what's right or wrong, I'm not gonna go out and condemn these people, because I've never even come close to having to deal with something like that. And as much as I'd like to sit here and say I know I would do the right thing, yeah, obviously I think I would, but until you face it, you don't know really. So let's give a little grace here. I think we should. Continuing on with the Russian Church, the fall of Constantinople in 1453 was interpreted by many in Russia as God's punishment for its having agreed to reunion with heretical Rome. So we talked about that already. People looked at it as, well, they got what they had coming to them. They tried to bring us back to Rome, and God immediately wiped them out. Look at what happened. Even though, I'm not saying God didn't do it, but it was going to happen. That's why they tried to reunite with Rome. But anyway, regardless of that, that's the way people saw it. These believed that just as Constantinople had replaced Rome as the second Rome, now Moscow was the third Rome, now tasked with upholding orthodoxy. So interestingly enough, the Russian Church begins to believe that, okay, now we're going to carry the torch. Rome gave it up because they went heretical, so Constantinople had to be established. But now it gave up. It was taken over by the Turks, but even more than that, there was this forced unity with the West, and so it lost the privilege of being, now it's us, now it's our turn. And they believed they were kind of the next in line to carry on the Orthodox teaching. In 1547, Ivan IV of Russia took the title of Tsar, or Emperor, by which he meant that he was the successor of the ancient Caesars of Rome and Constantinople. So Russia's kind of taking this course that they're continuing on the empire. They're the ones that are going to continue it on, that has been lost because of what happened in the Western world and then Constantinople falling to the Turks. Likewise, in 1598, the Metropolitan of Moscow took the title of Patriarch. So he's going to take that title that was once given to the leader in Constantinople. He's going to take it on now in Moscow. The Russian Church produced an array of polemical writings against Greeks, Catholics, and Protestants. By the 17th century, these notions were so entrenched that an attempt at rapprochement with the Greeks led to schism in Russia. So they did too good of a job of saying we're better than all the rest of these groups, because eventually when they tried to come back together, well, it was so ingrained in people's heads that Greek's bad, Russian good, that the act of trying to reunite led to a schism. Kind of the same thing with the East and the West. The Eastern Church had done such a good job of convincing people that the Roman Church was heretical that it was unthinkable to them that they would ever reunite. And so when the time came that they wanted to do that, they couldn't. And the same thing kind of is what we're seeing here. Tsar Alexis I saw this rapprochement with Greek Christians as a preliminary step to the conquest of Constantinople. So the Tsar is thinking, I'm not going to just establish myself as the new Roman Empire. I want to go out and take what the old part had, and let's go over and retake Constantinople. But many in Russia, particularly among the lower classes, reacted violently. They were suspicious of anything foreign, especially since it seemed it was the aristocracy that was interested in promoting the new ideas. Now, it's not such a good idea to be against something automatically just because it's from a foreign point of view, but it's probably a pretty good bet that anytime the ruling powers want something really badly, it's not necessarily going to end up working out really great for those that are not in that group. And we've seen that through history. The aristocracy, the ruling powers, the upper whatever, however you want to put that, upper classes, whenever they try to convince somebody in the group below them how much it's going to help them to get what they want, then you can probably be pretty sure it's not going to help them. It's going to help the aristocracy, it's going to help them, but it's not going to help everybody else. But they had learned that lesson, and they were suspicious of this right off the bat. The result was the schism of the old believers, some of whom joined the peasants in rebellion. This was crushed after much bloodshed, and the peasant serfdom worsened. The old believers continued to exist, although they split over a number of issues. So there's going to be problems with this whole idea, and it's going to lead to a group rebelling, but it's not going to go well for them. Some were drawn to apocalyptic extremes, and thousands committed suicide as proof of their faith. So it's a pretty dark time. Eventually, however, the more extreme groups disappeared, and the old believers lived on as a minority group within Russia until the 21st century. So they held out for a while, but eventually they went away. Tsar Peter the Great took a different approach. He was not interested in a rapprochement with Greek Christians, but rather to opening his country to Western influences. So surely you've heard Peter the Great. He wants to bring in the Western ideas. And so he drops the Greek stuff, but now he wants to get united with the West. Well, the Eastern Church isn't going to like that either. This led to increased interest in both Catholic and Protestant theology in the church. Those who followed these conflicting schools of thought did not abandon their Orthodox faith. Instead, they sought to develop an Orthodox theology using either Catholic or Protestant methodologies. So basically, people wanted to study these ideas. They didn't want to become Protestants. They didn't want to become Catholics, but they wanted to use what they liked from them and bring it into Eastern Orthodoxy. And so they tried to kind of marry the two and yet still remain tied to their Orthodox faith. The Kievan school, whose great figure was Peter Mogila, was associated with Catholic tendencies, while Theophanes Prokopovich and his followers felt that the Protestant critique of tradition ought to be headed by Russian Orthodoxy. So you had some figures rising up that were kind of associating themselves, one with the Catholic idea, one with the Protestant idea, but still trying to merge them with Orthodoxy, not abandon Orthodoxy. Early in the 19th century, the influence of the Enlightenment and Romanticism gave the Prokopovichians the upper hand. But later in the century, a nationalist reaction occurred which valued what was traditionally Russian, the Slavophile movement. I'm not good with these Russian words, so y'all forgive me. I'm butchering some of this, but anyway, my Louisiana upbringing didn't teach me a whole lot of Russian. This movement attempted to show that the true Orthodox understanding of Catholicity is a perfect synthesis of the Catholic thesis of the authority of the Church and the Protestant antithesis of the freedom of the gospel. So they're trying to kind of merge both of these ideas and bring about a thinking that there's authority within the church while also there is freedom in the gospel. So kind of trying to take the best of both worlds approach. The Russian Revolution put an end to much of the debate. So this is going to all be taken out. A different Western philosophy, Marxism, gained the upper hand. In 1918, the church was officially separated from the state. So this is where things are going to kind of go down for the church. They're not have the luxury of debating anything anymore because they're going to just have to try to survive. In 1920, religious teaching in school was outlawed. 2 years before, all seminaries were closed. In 1943, due to a need for all possible support in the war, the government decided to recognize the continued existence of the Russian Orthodox Church. That year, seminaries were reopened. Also, permission was granted for the printing of some books and periodicals and for the manufacture of items necessary for worship. So the church was it wasn't completely done away with, but the things that it needed in order to be successful were done away with. But in 1943, obviously that's the middle of World War II, the Russia knows they need everybody to be united as one to fight this war. And so they realized they knew there's still a lot of people in the Russian Orthodox Church. They hadn't abandoned it. And so they wanted to get the support of them. And so things kind of loosened up for the church at that point. As in the case of other Orthodox churches under communist rule, the Russian church found its liturgy capable of supporting the faithful and transmitting the traditions to new generations. So we see that throughout this period of time in these Orthodox churches throughout these nations in which they are stamped down or under persecution or at least trying to be silenced. They were strong enough to withstand that, and we'll see that as we go through this. Well, there are other traditions to look at other than just Russia, so let's look at some of the other Eastern churches. Orthodox bodies also exist in various parts of the world. Some of these, such as the Orthodox Church of Japan and those in China and Korea, were the result of the missionary work of the Russian Church. And so Orthodox churches all throughout these Asian nations are they're the result of the missionary work of the Russian Church. Others are the result of the Orthodox diaspora. For a number of reasons, large numbers of Orthodox moved to areas distant from their homelands, And as the church is becoming more persecuted through time in those areas, or at least its influence is going away, you can understand why some of them left. Particularly in Western Europe and the New World, numbers of Russians, Greeks, and others held to the liturgy as a means of keeping alive their traditions and values. So church is very much a big part of their culture. And so as they go into new places where their culture is not going to be the predominant culture, they want to hold on to those old traditions and cultures. They don't want to lose them. The church part of it is going to be a big part of keeping that together. But not all Eastern churches were part of the Orthodox communion. Since the time of the Christological controversies in the 5th century, a number of Eastern churches that disagreed with the decision of the councils had established an independent existence. So don't have time to go back over all that. If you want to look back at that in season 1, you can. But there were churches that had kind of broken away from the main church, even as far back as the 5th century, and they had established themselves independently. In the former territories of the Persian Empire, the majority of Christians refused to call Mary the Mother of God and were therefore dubbed Nestorians or Assyrian. So they didn't like that term Mother of God. They wouldn't go along with it, so they were cast out. This group became heavily persecuted. Many of the survivors fled to the Western Hemisphere, but in the 21st century, their total membership was approximately 100,000, mostly in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and the United States. So that's one of the groups. Those churches that refused to accept the Chalcedonian definition of faith because it seemed to divide the humanity of Jesus from his divinity are called monophysites. So again, this is stuff we talked about in the first season. And these are kind of these groups that splintered off, that didn't go along with the Orthodox way. They didn't cease to exist. They didn't just stop. They continued. They were smaller. They were isolated, but they had continued on and were still in existence during this period of time. The ancient Syrian monophysite church continued to be strong in Syria and Iraq. Its head, the Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch, resided in Damascus. Technically under his authority, but in reality autonomous, the Syrian church in India was fully indigenous and had about 500,000 members. So there's several of these traditions you see here that existed independent of the Eastern Orthodox Church, but still were in the East. Let's look at a few more of these. The Armenian church refused to accept the Chalcedonian definition of faith. Their territory was conquered by the Turks, and their refusal to abandon the faith of their ancestors was one of several causes of enmity between them and the Turks. As the power of the Ottoman Empire waned, their enmity turned to violence. In 1895, 1896, and 1914, thousands of Armenians living under Turkish rule were massacred. So they went through a big massacre of their own. Approximately 1 million managed to escape, and as a result, by the 21st century, there were significant numbers of Armenian Christians in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Greece, France, and the Western Hemisphere. So this group got out of the area, they got away from where they were being killed and moved out, and still exist to this day. In the early decades of the 20th century, the participation of the Eastern churches in the ecumenical movement was reserved. They didn't want to get involved in it because they didn't want to have any discussions about their theology. They felt like even entering into a situation where they would even come up for discussion would be to compromise, and they didn't want to do that, so they stayed out of all this stuff. When the invitation was sent for churches to attend the first assembly of the World Council of Churches, which was to take place in Amsterdam in 1948, most of the Orthodox churches abstained, and they had agreed that they were going to abstain. But in 1950, most of the Orthodox churches became full members of the World Council of Churches. The World Council of Churches kind of reached out to them and said, look, come and be a part of this. We're not going to be pushing you to agree with anything that we say. It's not about that. And they were able to convince them, and then they went and became part of it. Through the agency of the World Council of Churches, there were significant conversations between those churches that accepted the definition of faith of Chalcedon and those that rejected it. So they were able to kind of not just have a better relationship with churches in the West, but even among the churches in the East. In these conversations, it was found that there was profound agreement among these various bodies, and that many of their disagreements were the result of misunderstandings. And in a lot of ways, that happens in a lot of this kind of stuff. You have a lot of people that they are saying the same thing, they really agree, but they don't They can't listen to each other long enough to realize that. And maybe there are points of disagreement, but it's not enough that they can't have anything to do with each other, and yet they have abandoned one another. And I'm not saying there are not hills to die on, because I definitely think there are. But some of this stuff is just goofy. And some of it, again, is the result of just flat out misunderstandings. Well, wait a minute. If we start talking about it, we're really saying the same thing. So this was a big step in trying to kind of bridge those gaps and be able to have good relationships. Thus, the ecumenical movement promoted a valuable dialogue among Eastern Christians, and it was something they needed for sure. So let's finish out today by looking at the result of the fall of the Soviet Union on the churches that were residing in the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union brought enormous changes to the Orthodox churches in the area, obviously. The world was surprised that, after more than 8 decades of suppression, Christianity still showed enormous force. So, again, look throughout history. We've talked about this time and time again. Anywhere the church is persecuted, it thrives. You can't stamp it out. The more you fight it, the more you go against it, the more sure you can be that it's going to survive. And this is another example of this. In 1989 alone, more than 1,000 new Orthodox communities emerged. A seminary opened in Siberia and another in Belarus, and several monasteries that had been closed reopened. In 1993, the Orthodox University of Moscow was founded. There is no doubt that Orthodox Christianity emerged from Soviet rule with great signs of vitality. So, upon the fall of the Soviet Union, what was already there was strong, got even stronger. Not all events were positive for the Orthodox Church, though. They now had to deal with the presence of other Christian communities. So now that Soviet Union is no more, other Christian community groups can develop, or they come back out too. Catholic bishops were named for Moscow and other Russian cities. Several uniate bodies came to the foreground and demanded the properties they had lost to official orthodoxy, so that's going to be a problem. In Yugoslavia, where civil war ensued, religious conflicts between Muslims, Orthodox, and Catholics led to gross violations of human rights. So again, in Yugoslavia, that was bad. Problems existed outside the former Soviet Union as well. In the United States, Latin America, and other regions, Eastern Orthodox immigrants and their descendants carried their faith with them. Each group continued relating to the church of its ancestors. Because of this, there were now different Orthodox churches in the same nation, each owing allegiance to a different patriarch or archbishop in its country of origin. Traditionally, there would only be one Orthodox church, any country. There wouldn't be a bunch of different ones. And as time went on, each of these groups came to the United States from somewhere else, and they're bringing their version of the Orthodox Church with them. So several, it's not just one, it's going to be a bunch of them, and that's going to cause confusion and tension for a while. The result of the perseverance of the Orthodox Church during the tough times they faced was that Eastern Orthodoxy would make an important contribution to the liturgical renewal of the 20th and 21st centuries and would prove attractive to Protestants seeking deeper roots in Christian traditions. So that's kind of a summary of what's going to happen with the Eastern Church, and that's a very broad, and I know we've only hit on very broad points, but that's at least an idea of where the Eastern Church went from the time we kind of left it after season 1 to where it's at today. So thanks for taking time today to listen to this. Next week, we're going to look at Protestant theology. I think you'll be very interested in the development of Protestant theology through this period of time. And we'll look at some concepts, some you'll probably be definitely very familiar with, and some maybe you'll be hearing about for the first time, or at least hear the origins of it for the first time. So I think you'll enjoy that. Hope that you can join me again next week. In the meantime, God bless.